My parents rejected my $65,000 tech startup that had $180,000 in confirmed purchase orders, calling it too risky, then immediately approved a $625,000 loan for my brother to buy a BMW M5 Porsche 911, Lamborghini Huracan, and Ferrari 488 to become a social media influencer with 0 followers. I'm 31 years old, and I spent 3 years building software development experience and industry relationships to create a viable business, only to watch my parents dismiss my detailed proposal as a fantasy, while celebrating my 26-year-old brother's plan to get famous by posting car photos on Instagram. Joseph had never held a job longer than 6 months, never earned a single dollar of revenue, and lived in my parents' basement playing video games. Here's the impossible part. Successful accountants who built their own business from nothing called a software company with actual paying customers too risky, then immediately funded a luxury car collection for someone who'd never generated income in his life. 12 construction companies had already signed letters of intent to buy my scheduling software. But my parents treated Joseph's Instagram dreams as a legitimate business investment. This happened in 2024, when tech startups are everywhere and social media influencer scams are obvious to anyone paying attention. My parents knew exactly what they were doing when they chose to fund their golden child's fantasy over their competent son's viable business. But here's what they didn't see coming. I built the company anyway with my own money, and within 2 years, my fantasy business was generating over $2 million in annual revenue, while their $600,000 investment was being repossessed by banks. Joseph never gained a single real follower, never earned a dollar, and drove my parents to the edge of bankruptcy. That's when they showed up on my front porch, desperate and broken, begging for money, to save them from the catastrophic consequences of betting everything on their golden child. I listened to their desperate plea for help, then delivered the most satisfying response of my life, using their exact words against them. My too risky company became worth millions, while their smart investment destroyed their retirement. To understand how my parents could make such catastrophic business decisions, you need to know that they're not financially naive people who don't understand risk assessment. My parents, Robert and Linda, built their accounting practice from nothing over 20 years ago and turned it into one of the most respected firms in our area. They started with a shared desk in a strip mall office and grew their client base through competent work and careful financial planning. They understand cash flow market analysis, profit margins, and investment risk better than 90% of small business owners. Their firm handles books for over 200 local businesses, from restaurants to construction companies to tech startups. They've seen every type of business succeed and fail. They know what viable business models look like. They understand the difference between realistic projections and wishful thinking. They've guided countless clients through good investments and talked them out of terrible ones. My parents built a successful accounting practice from nothing, but their business competence never extended to how they treated their 2 sons. Joseph was always the child who needed their help, their guidance, their financial support. He'd failed out of 2 different colleges, both fully funded by my parents. He'd started 3 different businesses: a food truck that never bought a truck, a clothing line that never sold clothes, and a cryptocurrency trading scheme that lost their money within 2 months. Every failure was met with understanding and more funding. Joseph just needs to find his passion, Mom would say. He's creative and entrepreneurial. He just needs the right opportunity, Dad would add. Joseph was 26 years old, living in their basement, and had never held a job for longer than 6 months. but they treated his dependency as evidence that he needed more support, not less. Meanwhile, I'd moved out at 22, gotten my own apartment, worked my way through college, and built a career in software development without asking them for a dime. I paid my own bills, managed my own finances, and made my own decisions about my career and life. Joseph was the son who needed them. I was too independent. The irony wasn't lost on me, that while my parents were building a business helping other people make smart financial decisions, they were systematically making terrible decisions about their own family. I'd spent 3 years at a software development firm, learning exactly how the construction industry technology market worked. I understood the pain points, the inefficiencies, the gaps in existing software solutions. I'd built relationships with project managers, contractors, and construction company owners, who all complained about the same scheduling and coordination problems. I knew which features they needed, what they were willing to pay for, and how to market to them effectively. I had industry contacts who trusted my technical skills and business judgment. My business plan wasn't theoretical or wishful thinking. It was based on real market research, actual customer feedback, and proven demand for the solution I was proposing to build. I'd spent 3 years learning exactly how this industry worked. Armed with 3 years of industry knowledge and real market validation, I decided it was time to formally approach my parents about funding my software company. I wasn't looking for charity or family favors. I was presenting a legitimate business opportunity to people who understood business. I spent 2 weeks preparing a comprehensive presentation. 40 pages of market analysis, revenue projections, development timelines, and competitive landscape research. I documented the specific problems my software would solve, identified my target market, and outlined exactly how construction companies were currently wasting money on inefficient scheduling systems. But the centerpiece of my proposal was the letters of intent. I'd collected from 12 construction companies, representing $180,000 in confirmed first-year purchases. These weren't vague expressions of interest or hypothetical maybes. These were signed commitments from companies that had already budgeted for scheduling software purchases. I scheduled a dinner meeting with my parents and presented my business plan the same way I'd present to any professional investor. I walked them through the market opportunity, explained the technical solution, demonstrated the competitive advantages, and showed them the financial projections based on real customer commitments. I laid out exactly how the software would solve construction scheduling problems. My father looked through the documentation for about 10 minutes before delivering his verdict. "This is way too risky, Finn," he said, pushing the papers back across the table. "Software companies fail all the time. You have no guarantee these customers will actually pay once you build the product." When I pointed to the signed purchase commitments, he dismissed them as just promises on paper. And when I explained my industry experience and technical background, he said I was getting ahead of yourself. When I showed him the revenue projections based on confirmed orders, he called the whole thing unrealistic. "Listen," my mother added, "you're so independent anyway. You don't really need our help to figure things out. This kind of business venture is just too uncertain for us to get involved in." The rejection was absolute and final. My software company, backed by real customers and real purchase commitments, was too risky for their investment consideration. Dad called my business plan a fantasy that would never work. 3 days after my parents rejected my viable tech startup as too risky, Joseph announced his own business plan at Sunday dinner. His proposal was breathtakingly simple. He wanted to buy luxury sports cars and become a social media influencer by posting photos of himself with expensive vehicles. Joseph's entire market research consisted of watching YouTube videos of other influencers showing off cars. He had no followers, no content strategy, no understanding of how social media monetization actually worked, and no business plan beyond buy cars, take photos, get famous. When my parents asked about revenue projections, Joseph said he'd figure that out once the content goes viral. When they asked about his target audience, he said, people who like cool cars. When they asked about his experience in content creation or marketing, he said, how hard can it be? His presentation lasted 15 minutes and consisted entirely of showing them photos of cars he wanted to buy and Instagram accounts he wanted to emulate. Joseph's plan was to become famous by buying expensive cars. My parents' reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. This is so creative, my mother said. Joseph has such an entrepreneurial spirit. My father nodded approvingly. Social media is the future. This could be a real opportunity. Within 48 hours, they'd co-signed a $625,000 bank loan for Joseph to purchase a BMW, a Porsche 911, a Lamborghini Huracan, and a Ferrari 488. No business plan required. No market research needed. No revenue projections necessary. The bank approved the loan based entirely on my parents' accounting practice as collateral and their personal guarantees. Joseph didn't even need to provide documentation of his business strategy beyond a handwritten list of cars he wanted to buy. The same parents who'd called my software company too uncertain were now celebrating their son's plan to spend over $500,000 on luxury vehicles with no clear path to profitability. They co-signed a $600,000 loan the same week they rejected mine. When I pointed out the obvious contradiction between rejecting my business for being risky while approving Joseph's obviously speculative venture, my parents had their explanations ready. Joseph needs our support to pursue his dreams, my mother said. He's always been creative, and this could be his breakthrough opportunity. My father added, besides, luxury cars hold their value. It's not like the money would just disappear. When I reminded them that I'd presented actual customer commitments while Joseph had only vague hopes about social media fame, my mother's response was telling, "You're so independent anyway, Finn. You don't really need our help to succeed. Joseph needs more guidance and support." The logic was perfect in its circular absurdity. My competence and self-reliance were evidence that I didn't deserve support, while Joseph's complete lack of business experience was proof that he needed their investment. Mom said Joseph needed support, but I was too independent anyway. After my parents made it clear that family support wasn't available for my risky business venture, I decided to prove them wrong using my own resources. I had $25,000 in personal savings, money I'd accumulated over 3 years of working in software development while living frugally and planning for exactly this opportunity. I converted my garage into a home office, bought the necessary development equipment, and started building the construction scheduling software that my parents had dismissed as a fantasy. I didn't need their money to validate my business plan. I had 12 companies that had already committed to purchasing the software once it was completed. My first client was Miller Construction, one of the companies that had signed a letter of intent during my market research phase. They paid me $15,000 up front for a customized version of the scheduling system, which gave me the initial cash flow to continue development, while proving that real customers would pay real money for my solution. The work was exactly as challenging and rewarding as I'd expected. I was solving genuine problems for businesses that desperately needed better operational efficiency, and they were willing to pay premium prices for software that actually worked. I started the company they called Impossible with my own money. Within 6 months, my too risky software company had generated its first $50,000 in revenue. Miller Construction was so satisfied with their custom scheduling system that they'd referred me to 3 other construction companies in their network. My client base was expanding through word-of-mouth recommendations from actual users who were seeing measurable improvements in their project coordination. The business fundamentals were exactly what I'd projected in the proposal my parents had rejected. Development costs were manageable. Client acquisition was happening organically, and profit margins were healthy because I was solving expensive problems with elegant technical solutions. I wasn't just breaking even or covering expenses. I was generating positive cash flow and building a sustainable business that was proving its value to customers every day. The purchase orders I'd shown my parents were converting into actual payments, and those satisfied customers were generating new business through referrals. Within 6 months, I'd proven their risk assessment completely wrong. Meanwhile, Joseph's social media influencer career was developing exactly as anyone with basic business sense could have predicted. 6 months after taking delivery of his BMW M5, Porsche 911, Lamborghini Huracan, and Ferrari 488, his Instagram account had accumulated a whopping 300 followers. Most of his followers were family members, high school friends, and employees from the dealerships where he'd purchased the cars. His posts typically received between 5 and 15 likes, mostly from the same group of people who felt obligated to engage with his content out of politeness or family loyalty. Joseph was spending $8,000 per month in combined car payments, insurance, and maintenance costs, while generating exactly $0 in influencer income. He was still living in my parents' basement, using their Wi-Fi to upload photos of cars that were driving them deeper into debt every month. The delusion was complete and unsustainable. Joseph genuinely believed that social media fame was just around the corner, that his next post might go viral, that brands would start paying him for endorsements once his follower count reached some magical threshold he could never quite define. Joseph's followers were mostly family members and car dealership employees. By the end of my 2nd year in business, I had compiled documentation that told the complete story of what my parents' risk assessment had really cost them. My software company wasn't just profitable. It was generating $2.3 million in annual revenue and had grown to 15 employees. I'd landed contracts with 3 Fortune 500 construction companies who were using my scheduling software to coordinate multi-million-dollar projects across dozens of job sites. The fantasy that my parents had dismissed was now being used to manage over $500 million worth of construction projects annually. The technical innovation that had seemed so risky to my parents was now recognized by industry leaders as a significant advancement in construction project management. Major firms were licensing my software, not because they felt sorry for me or wanted to help a startup, but because my solution was genuinely superior to anything else available in the market. I kept detailed records of every milestone, every client contract, every revenue benchmark, and of every industry recognition. Not out of spite, but because successful businesses document their growth metrics. The numbers told a story that was impossible to argue with or dismiss as luck. My fantasy business was generating millions in annual revenue. Meanwhile, Joseph's social media influencer career was generating exactly what any rational person would have predicted from the beginning. Nothing. After 2 full years of posting car photos on Instagram, his total income from social media content was $0 and 0 cents. His follower count had plateaued at around 400 people, most of whom were still family members, high school acquaintances, and car dealership staff who followed him out of professional courtesy. His posts averaged 8 likes and 2 comments, usually from the same 3 people, who felt obligated to engage with his content. But Joseph's income wasn't the only thing stuck at zero. The math on his car payments, insurance, maintenance, and depreciation was devastating. $8,000 per month in expenses with zero income meant that every month Joseph was adding to the debt burden that my parents had co-signed. The $625,000 loan was now approaching $700,000, with accumulated interest and fees. The cars were depreciating faster than the loan balance was decreasing, which meant my parents were underwater on an investment that had never generated a single dollar of return. Joseph's influencer career generated exactly $0 in 2 years. The impact on my parents' finances was exactly what anyone familiar with business fundamentals could have predicted. Their accounting practice, which had been profitable and stable for 20 years, was now struggling under the weight of Joseph's car loan payments. They'd used their business as collateral for the loan, which meant that Joseph's Instagram fantasy was putting their entire professional legacy at risk. They were tapping their home equity to make monthly payments on cars that were losing value every day, while generating no income whatsoever. My father, who had lectured me about the importance of conservative financial planning, was now using credit cards to cover business expenses because so much of their cash flow was going toward Joseph's monthly car payments. My mother was talking about postponing retirement because their savings had been depleted by their son's social media dreams. The successful accounting practice that had been their life's work was being systematically destroyed by the same decision-making process that had labeled my viable business as too risky. Their successful accounting practice was being destroyed by Joseph's car payments. While my parents were facing financial crisis due to their catastrophic investment in Joseph's fantasy, the business community was recognizing my software company as exactly what I'd always claimed it was: an innovative solution to real industry problems. I received the Tech Innovation Award from the Regional Business Council for developing software that was measurably improving efficiency across the construction industry. I was invited to speak at 3 industry conferences about the technical challenges of construction project coordination. The local business journal featured my company in their annual Startups to Watch issue, and I was being considered for the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in the enterprise technology category. Industry publications were writing articles about how my scheduling software was setting new standards for project management efficiency. The same business plan that my parents had dismissed as unrealistic was now being studied by business schools as an example of successful market analysis and product development. The too risky venture was being held up as a model of how to identify genuine market needs and build solutions that customers actually want to buy. The industry called my risky fantasy an innovative breakthrough. Around month 18 of Joseph's failing influencer career, when the financial reality of their situation was becoming impossible to ignore, my parents began reaching out to me with increasingly transparent attempts to assess my willingness to help with their growing crisis. The first few calls were awkward attempts at casual conversation. "How's your little business doing?" my mother would ask, as if my multi-million-dollar company was still the garage startup she'd dismissed 2 years earlier. "I hope you're not working too hard," my father would add, fishing for information about my financial situation. Within a few weeks, the calls became more direct. Mom started mentioning how challenging the accounting business had become lately, how some unexpected expenses had put pressure on their cash flow. Dad began hinting that Joseph was still figuring out his business model, and that social media success takes longer than expected. I could hear the desperation creeping into their voices as they realized that their golden child's luxury car collection was systematically destroying their financial stability. But they were too proud to admit the full scope of their mistake, so they approached the conversation sideways, hoping I'd volunteer to help, without them having to ask directly. Mom started calling to ask how my little business was doing, knowing that my parents would eventually swallow their pride and ask for direct financial help. I prepared myself emotionally and legally for that conversation. I scheduled a consultation with my business attorney to understand the implications of lending money to family members who were facing potential bankruptcy. The attorney's advice was clear: lending money to people who had already demonstrated catastrophically poor judgment about risk assessment was itself a high-risk investment. Any family loan would likely be a gift in disguise, since people who'd borrowed $600,000 for a social media fantasy probably weren't good candidates for loan repayment. More importantly, I realized that helping my parents financially would only enable them to avoid learning the natural consequences of their favoritism. Bailing them out would teach them that their dismissive attitude toward my capabilities didn't matter, because I'd rescue them anyway. I decided they'd get exactly the same answer they gave me when I needed support. Not out of spite, but because people who make decisions based on family favoritism instead of business fundamentals need to learn that competence matters more than birth order. I decided they'd get exactly the same answer they gave me. 2 weeks later, my mother called to say they were planning a family visit. Not for any special occasion, just to spend some time together and catch up properly. She mentioned that Joseph would be joining them because it's been so long since all of us were together. I knew exactly what this visit was really about. My parents had reached the point where phone calls and hints weren't sufficient for the level of financial help they needed. They were planning to show up at my house with Joseph in tow, hoping that seeing their struggling son in person would guilt me into offering the financial assistance they were too proud to request directly. The timing wasn't coincidental. I'd been tracking the loan payment schedule on Joseph's cars, and they were approaching a point where the monthly payments would become unsustainable, even with creative financial juggling. This was their last chance to get help before facing repossession or bankruptcy. I prepared for the conversation by remembering every dismissive word they'd said about my business plan, every condescending comment about my independence, every explanation about why Joseph deserved support, while I didn't. They showed up at my house with Joseph looking desperate. When my parents arrived at my house that Saturday afternoon, the contrast between our situations was immediately visible. They pulled up in my father's aging sedan, the same car they'd been driving for 5 years, because their cash flow was now dedicated to Joseph's luxury car payments. I was standing on the front porch of the house I'd purchased with profits from my fantasy software company. Joseph climbed out of the passenger seat, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past too. The stress of watching his Instagram career fail, while knowing his parents were sacrificing everything to fund his delusion, had clearly taken its toll. My parents looked tired in a way that went beyond normal aging. This was the exhaustion that comes from watching your financial security evaporate month by month. They approached my front porch like visitors, not family members, which perfectly captured the power dynamic that had shifted completely since they'd rejected my business proposal 3 years earlier. They stood on my front porch like door-to-door salespeople. The conversation started with awkward small talk, but my father quickly cut to the purpose of their visit. "Finn, we need to talk to you about a serious financial situation," he said, his voice carrying none of the confidence he'd had when dismissing my business plan. "Joseph's social media business is taking longer to generate income than we anticipated," my mother added, unable to say the words complete failure, even when the evidence was overwhelming. "The car payments have become challenging to manage, and we're facing some cash flow problems with the accounting practice." My father laid out the numbers with the same precision he used for client presentations, But this time, he was the one asking for help instead of giving financial advice. They needed $650,000 to pay off Joseph's car loans and save their accounting practice from bankruptcy. The irony was perfect. They were asking for exactly 10 times the amount they'd refused to invest in my viable business, and they needed it to save themselves from the consequences of funding Joseph's obvious fantasy. Dad asked for exactly 10 times what I'd originally requested. I listened to their complete financial breakdown with the same professional attention I'd hoped they would give my business proposal 3 years earlier. They explained how Joseph's car payments had consumed their savings, how they'd refinanced their house to make loan payments, how their accounting practice was now at risk because they'd used it as collateral for Joseph's dreams. When they finished their presentation, I gave them the response they'd earned through their own words and actions. "This sounds way too risky," I said, using my father's exact tone and phrasing from our dinner 3 years earlier. "Family loans fail all the time. I have no guarantee you'd actually pay me back once I solve your problems." When they tried to explain the urgency of their situation, I dismissed their explanations as unrealistic expectations. When they mentioned their decades of business success, I told them they were getting ahead of themselves. "Wait a let then," I continued, echoing my mother's dismissive language. "You're so independent anyway. You don't really need my help to figure things out. This kind of financial situation is just too uncertain for me to get involved in." I told them their request sounded like a fantasy to me. The shock on their faces was profound and immediate. They had never considered that their own words and logic could be used against them, that the dismissive attitude they'd shown toward my capabilities could be returned when they needed my help. But I wasn't finished delivering the justice they'd earned through 3 years of favoritism and financial recklessness. "You had a choice 3 years ago," I said firmly. "You could have invested in a viable business with real customers and real revenue potential. Instead, you chose to fund a luxury car collection for someone who'd never earned $1 in his life. Now you're facing the consequences of that choice, and you want me to bail you out using money I earned from the company you called a fantasy. The answer is no." When my father tried to argue about family loyalty and mutual support, I delivered the final response that permanently established the new boundaries of our relationship. "I need you to get off my property," I said, using the same dismissive tone they'd perfected over years of treating my independence as a character flaw. "And don't come back unless you're here to apologize for every time you chose to support incompetence over competence." I told them to get off my property just like they'd dismissed my dreams. In the months following that front porch confrontation, my software company continued its growth trajectory without any interference or input from family members who had once dismissed it as impossible. I expanded the development team, launched new product features, and secured contracts with 2 additional Fortune 500 companies who wanted enterprise-level scheduling solutions. The business that my parents had called too risky became the industry standard for construction project coordination. Major firms were licensing my software not because they felt sorry for a startup, but because my technical solution was genuinely superior to anything else available in the market. I bought a larger office building, hired a full-time sales team, and began developing additional software products for other industries that had similar coordination challenges. The company was no longer just profitable. It was becoming a significant player in enterprise software development. The independence that my parents had always treated as a character flaw turned out to be exactly what I needed to build something they could never control, diminish, or take credit for. I made decisions based on business merit rather than family politics. Hired employees based on competence rather than favoritism, and measured success by results rather than birth order. My too risky company became the industry standard. My parents learned to live with the consequences of their financial decisions, without any assistance from the son they'd dismissed 3 years earlier. Their accounting practice survived, but just barely, and they were forced to downsize their lifestyle to manage Joseph's remaining debt payments. Joseph eventually found work at a local auto dealership. Ironically, the same dealership where he'd purchased 2 of the luxury cars that had bankrupted his parents. He was earning minimum wage plus commission, learning for the first time in his life what it meant to work for money rather than simply asking for it. My parents never contacted me again after that day on my front porch. They'd finally learned that competence and character matter more than family favoritism. But they learned it through bankruptcy court filings and repossessed vehicles rather than through wisdom and humility. The successful accounting practice that had been their life's work was permanently diminished by their decision to fund their golden child's fantasy instead of supporting their competent son's viable business. They'd had a choice between investing in proven ability or wishful thinking, and they chose poorly. They learned that betting everything on the golden child was the riskiest investment of all.